Thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to this public defense of the thesis entitled Physical Activity, Cardiorespiratory Fitness, and Cardiometabolic Risk Factors from Childhood to Young Adulthood. Today's candidate, Anders Husøy, completed his thesis in April 2024. Based on a proposal from the Department of Sports Medicine, the Committee for Research Education has appointed the following committee to judge the thesis and other requirements for the award. The chairperson is Associate Professor Julie Sørbø Stang, Norwegian School of Sports Sciences. The first opponent will be Principal Researcher Dr. Tuija Tamelin, Jyväskylä University of Applied Sciences from Finland. The second opponent is Professor Jos Twisk, Amsterdam University Medical Centers from the Netherlands. The committee has concluded that the thesis meets the standard worthy of a public defense for the award of Doctor of Philosophy in Sport Science. Earlier today, the candidate has given a trial lecture with the title, How to Decrease Sedentary Behavior Among Older Adults. The trial lecture has been found satisfactory by the examination committee. I now would like to ask the candidate to introduce his doctoral research in the form of a short lecture, and the opposing members of the examination committee to engage the candidate in a defense of the work. Should members of the audience wish to ask questions relating to the research, I ask you to bring these in written form to the attention of the chairperson, Julia, in the break prior to the second opponent's questions, because we will have a break. I now ask the candidate to take his place at the lectern. Please, Anders.
Dear everyone, thank you all for coming here today for my PhD in defense. Tuija and Jos have done a thorough job reading my thesis, and now I will try to summarize it in a short, non-technical presentation for the rest of you. I'm sure we will get into details afterwards. The title on my thesis is Physical Activity, Cardiorespiratory Fitness, and Cardiometabolic Risk Factors from Childhood to Young Adulthood. My supervisors are Sigmund Alfred Andersen and Ulf Ekelund, both professors at the Department of Sports Medicine. Let's start with a quick background. Cardiometabolic risk factors. These are factors that all relate to the development of the atherogenic process and the type 2 diabetes mellitus, and thus increase the risk of cardiovascular diseases, or CVD. These risk factors include adiposity, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, which is unfavorable cholesterol levels, dysfunctional carbohydrate metabolism, which means high fasting blood sugar or insulin levels, inflammatory state, low cardiorespiratory fitness, and physical inactivity. Cardiometabolic risk factors often cluster together and synergistically increasing the risk of CVD. This clustering of cardiometabolic risk factors is often referred to as the metabolic syndrome, and the metabolic syndrome first and foremost serves the purpose of identifying individuals at risk of both type 2 diabetes mellitus and CVD. While CVD typically manifests later in life, the risk of both clustering of cardiometabolic risk factors and development of CVD may begin in youth. On to physical activity and sedentary time. The energy cost of different physical activities is often described as the number of metabolic equivalents, or METs, where one MET is the amount of oxygen consumed at rest. Sedentary behavior is characterized by low energy expenditure, while physical activity is any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles, resulting in increased energy expenditure. As we can see, sedentary behavior is defined as spending time in activities requiring 1.5 METs or less, while time spent in physical activity is usually subcategorized into levels of intensity, such as light physical activity, or LPA, moderate physical activity, or MPA, and vigorous physical activity, or VPA. Additionally, we often use a category for all physical activity of at least moderate intensity, which is referred to as moderate to vigorous physical activity, or MVPA. MVPA is explicitly mentioned in the physical activity recommendations for children and adolescents, which is an average of 60 minutes per day of MVPA. For adults, the corresponding minimum recommendation is at least 150 minutes per day per week of MPA, at least 75 minutes per week of VPA, or an equivalent combination of the two. There are two main measurement methods of physical activity and sedentary time: self-reported measures, which have the advantages of being quick, cheap, and easy to distribute to many potential participants. However, they often overestimate time spent physically active and underestimate time spent sedentary, and often called recall bias. Device-based measures are objective measurements collecting either measures of energy expenditure, heart rate, acceleration, or a combination of these, and although more expensive and time-consuming, allow for more precise estimates of these behaviors. Cardiorespiratory fitness, or CRF, is a subcomponent of physical fitness and is the capacity of the respiratory and circulatory systems to supply oxygen to skeletal muscles for energy production during sustained physical activity. CRF is often reported as maximal oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, in adults, as peak oxygen uptake, or VO2 peak, in children and adolescents, or standardized as metabolic equivalents. VO2 max reflects the function of several physiological systems and is often considered as the best indicator of whole body health and function. CRF also have two main measurement methods. One is a direct measure of oxygen consumption through gas exchange analysis, and the others are indirect estimates through either submaximal exercise testing, field-based assessments, and/or non-exercise prediction equations. So, how are cardiometabolic risk, physical activity, and cardiorespiratory fitness related from childhood to young adulthood? Based on previous research, this is a hypothesized relationship between these variables over the life transition period from childhood through adolescence and into young adulthood. First, these variables may track over time, which means that childhood levels are predictive of levels in young adulthood. For example, tracking of obesity would mean that obesity in childhood is likely to persist into young adulthood. Second, both physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness have been associated to cardiometabolic risk factors in youth, but it remains unclear whether physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness work together or through separate pathways in relation to cardiometabolic health. Third, the associations between physical activity, cardiorespiratory fitness, and cardiometabolic risk factors, and then primarily obesity, may all be bidirectional, which means that each factor may both affect and be affected by the others. Clearly, the relationship between these variables over this time period appear highly complex. So, what are the gaps in the literature? No previous studies have examined how device-measured physical activity and sedentary time changes from childhood through adolescence into young adulthood. Whether physical activity and sedentary time are independently and prospectively prospectively associated to cardiometabolic risk factors in this life period remains unclear. There's a paucity of longitudinal studies examining tracking of clustered cardiometabolic risk from childhood to young adulthood, and no previous studies have included direct measures of VO2 peak and device-measured sedentary time in this risk score. The relationship between physical activity and CRF in association to cardiometabolic health remains unclear among youth. So, the aims of my PhD project, or the purpose, was to examine, 1, whether the association between physical activity and cardiometabolic risk factors in youth differ by level of CRF. This is paper 1. Temporal changes in device-measured physical activity and sedentary time from childhood to young adulthood, which is paper 2. The longitudinal relationship between physical activity and sedentary time in adolescence with various risk factors for developing CVD in young adulthood, paper 3. And tracking of sedentary time, CRF, and other cardiometabolic risk factors from childhood to young adulthood, which is paper 4. So, let's start with paper 1. This paper was a systematic review and was published in Journal of Sports Sciences in 2021 under the title Effect Modification by Cardiorespiratory Fitness on the Association Between Physical Activity and Cardiometabolic Health in Youth, a systematic review. After a systematic search of 2 major databases, PubMed and Embase, 8,978 records were identified, with 2 additional records identified through other sources. After removal of duplicates, 6,915 records were left for screening. After first screening titles and then abstracts, we were left with 49 papers assessed for eligibility through full text reading, and in the end, we ended up with 18 studies in a qualitative synthesis, 9 observational studies, and 9 intervention studies. Here are the results for the observational studies. To the right here, we can see arrows indicating whether any effect modification was reported. An upwards arrow means a significant effect modification in favor of low-fit youth. A diagonal upwards arrow means a non-significant effect modification in favor of low-fit youth, and a horizontal arrow means no effect modification. Downward arrows were used if an effect modification was observed in favor of high-fit youth. Out of 9 reported findings, 4 were significantly in favor of low-fit youth, 3 were non-significantly in favor of low-fit youth, and 2 studies reported no effect modification. As we can also see to the left, all but 1 of these studies were of cross-sectional design, which is reflected in the risk of bias assessment. All observational studies, except 1, received a high risk of bias assessment due to cross-sectional study design and often either a lack of description of or inadequate adjustment of putative confounders. Here are the corresponding results for the intervention studies. Of the 9 included studies, 3 reported an effect modification significantly in favor of low-fit youth, 3 were non-significantly in favor of low-fit youth, and 2 found no effect modification. The last study here reported 2 different outcomes, which both could be included, and that resulted in 2 findings. 1 significant effect modification in favor of low-fit youth, and 1 finding of no effect modification. Also, for the intervention studies, most were assessed to have a high risk of bias, mainly due to non-randomization in the group allocation. Here we can see all findings from the included studies grouped by type of outcome. Most studies examined biochemical markers and/or blood pressure as outcomes, while the others investigated change in either body composition or cardiorespiratory fitness. In total, 20 findings were included from 18 different papers based on 15 unique study samples. As we can see, most studies reported either a significant or a non-significant effect modification, which is dark green or light green in this figure. So for a summary of paper 1, 70% of the findings in this systematic review reported either a significant or a non-significant effect modification. All of these suggested that the beneficial associations of physical activity on cardiometabolic health markers were more pronounced among youth with the lowest levels of CRF. However, through a rigorous risk of bias assessment, we found that 72% of the studies had a high risk of bias, 28% had some risk of bias, and none had a low risk of bias. So, due to low quality evidence, it remains uncertain whether CRF modified the association of physical activity with cardiometabolic risk markers in youth, and whether the magnitude of associations has clinical importance. Let's move on to the last 3 papers. These all stemmed from the same study. The PANCS follow-up study. And PANCS here is short for physical activity among Norwegian children study. The first PANCS study was conducted in 2005-2006 and was a cross-sectional study of physical activity levels in a representative sample of Norwegian 9- and 15-year-old boys and girls. At the time of PANCS 2, which was in 2011-2012, the 9-year-olds from PANCS 1 had become 15 years of age, and all of these were invited to participate again. A total of 731 boys and girls participated again as 15-year-olds in PANCS 2, creating a longitudinal cohort that formed the basis for my PhD project. During 2019 to 2021, we collected data in the PANCS follow-up study, where 708 of the 731 participants were still registered in Norway and eligible for participation. Of these, 258, now 24-year-olds, opted to participate again. Of note, most of the data collection were during the COVID-19 pandemic period, which proved challenging. All participants were invited to come to Oslo for testing during a time when Oslo was the epicenter in Norway, and there was a general recommendation from the government of avoiding unnecessary domestic travels throughout the entire data collection. Over to methods. We used a wide search strategy in the recruitment process to the PANCS follow-up study. We started with postal invitations, then a follow-up call and SMS, and we also reached out through social media to those we could identify. We could tempt them with covering travel expenses and a gift card of 1,000 Norwegian kroner for participation. However, as I mentioned, COVID-19 complicated the data collection. For those who participated, the following measurements were collected: anthropometric measures, body composition and bone health through a DEXA scan, device-based measures of physical activity and sedentary behavior using a hip-worn accelerometer, physical fitness, where we measured a direct VO2 peak or VO2 max on treadmill, and hand grip strength as a proximal measure of upper body strength. We also measured blood pressure, blood samples, and a questionnaire. So ethical considerations and approvals, all necessary approvals were obtained before the start of the data collection, including a written informed consents from all participants. We also got approval for processing of personal data and an approval from the Internal Ethics Committee at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences. Updated postal addresses, telephone numbers, and status of residence were retrieved from the National Population Register of Norway. And of course, the PANCS follow-up study was conducted in concordance with the Declaration of Helsinki. So let's see what we found. We start out with paper 2. This paper was published in International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity in 2024 under the title Longitudinal Changes in Device-Measured Physical Activity from Childhood to Young Adulthood, the PANCS follow-up study. Here we can see time spent sedentary, in light physical activity, in moderate physical activity, and in vigorous physical activity at age 9, 15, and 24 years of age. These values are adjusted for sex, mean wear time of the accelerometer, a weekend to weekday wear ratio, and which month they wore the device in. The most notable change in physical activity and sedentary time occurred between the ages of 9 and 15, with a significant increase in sedentary time of about 150 minutes per day. Further, we observed a decrease in all intensities of physical activity between 9 and 15, with about 125 minutes per day for light physical activity, 16 minutes per day for moderate physical activity, and 8 minutes per day for vigorous physical activity. Between the ages of 15 and 24, there were only minor changes in comparison, with an increase of 11 minutes per day in light physical activity and 3 minutes per day in vigorous physical activity. Conversely, we observed a small decrease of 4 minutes per day in moderate physical activity and 10 minutes per day in sedentary time. The minutes per day spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity, or MVPA, decreased substantially from age 9 to 15, with about 25 minutes per day, but remained unchanged from 15 to 24 years, with only a minor decrease of half a minute per day. However, the change in MVPA over time differed between different subgroups. Here we can see the change of MVPA in subgroups of sex, and the p-value of the interaction term indicate that change in MVPA over time differed between these subgroups. Females had lower levels of MVPA at age 9 and 15, but had the highest level of MVPA at age 24. This figure illustrates change in MVPA over time in subgroups of BMI tertiles at baseline, and also these subgroups differed over time. The group in the highest baseline BMI had the lowest level of MVPA both at age 9 and age 15, but had the highest level of MVPA at age 24. And here we can see the change in MVPA by subgroups of maximal oxygen uptake tertiles at baseline, and once again, these groups differed over time. The group in the lowest VO2 max tertile at baseline had the lowest level of MVPA at age 9 and at age 15, but had the highest level of MVPA at age 24. As you may have noticed, all subgroups with the lowest levels of MVPA at age 9 and 15 years ended up with the highest level of MVPA at age 24 years. The change in MVPA over time did not differ between subgroups of socioeconomic status, which is here defined as parental income in 2011-2012. However, a tendency was observed where the participants with the highest earning parents had the highest level of MVPA at all time points. Tracking, the absolute tracking of physical activity from age 9 to 24 was weak, with stability coefficient of 0.18 and 0.16, where we set a threshold for weak tracking at 0.3 and below. However, children in the lowest quartile of MVPA and total physical activity at age 9 were almost 90% more likely to remain in these quartiles at age 24 compared to peers in the upper 3 quartiles at baseline. Overall, tracking was stronger from age 9 to 15 as compared to 15 to 24, and slightly stronger among females than among males. So for the summary of paper 2, physical activity declined and time spent sedentary increased from childhood to adolescence. From adolescence to young adulthood, these variables remained relatively stable. The change in MVPA differed between subgroups of sex, BMI tertiles at baseline, and VO2 peak tertiles at baseline. Tracking of physical activity from childhood to young adulthood was weak in terms of stability coefficient. However, those in the lowest quartile of MBPA and total physical activity at age 9 years were almost 90% more likely to be in that quartile at age 24 years as compared to those belonging to any of the 3 upper quartiles at baseline. So, over to paper 3. This paper has been revised for the second time at Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. Hopefully it will be accepted. The title is Prospective Associations of Physical Activity and Sedentary Time in Adolescents with Cardiometabolic Risk in Young Adulthood. Here we sought to examine how sedentary time, moderate to vigorous physical activity, and vigorous physical activity at age 15 years were associated with different cardiometabolic risk factors at age 24 years. In this paper, we used multiple imputation to address missing data. Thus, the analysis was performed on all 708 participants eligible for participation in the PANCS follow-up study. These tables often contain a lot of information, so I will try to make it easier for you. The significant finding in this table is the association between sedentary time at age 15 and VO2 peak at age 24. Higher levels of sedentary time in adolescence was associated with lower VO2 peak in young adulthood, an important and independent risk factor for developing cardiovascular diseases. Lower VO2 peak is associated with higher risk, and higher VO2 peak is associated with lower risk. Here we can see the corresponding table for time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity. Once again, the significant association was towards VO2 peak. However, here we observe that higher levels of MBPA in adolescence was associated with higher levels of VO2 peak in young adulthood. And finally, the associations between vigorous physical activity at age 15 years and cardiometabolic risk factors at age 24 years. The same association towards VO2 peak was seen as with MBPA, where higher levels of vigorous physical activity in adolescence was associated with higher levels of VO2 peak in young adulthood. Higher levels of VPA at age 15 was further associated with lower levels of visceral fat mass, insulin levels, and the clustered cardiometabolic risk score, which all are favorable changes. Furthermore, we found that the association of both MBPA and VPA with a clustered cardiometabolic risk score were modified by childhood BMI tertiles. Here we observe the greatest magnitude of association in the highest BMI tertile, which may imply that physical activity is most beneficial in youth who need it the most. So for a summary, strong prospective associations were observed between the exposures at age 15 years and VO2 peak at age 24 years. Higher sedentary time in adolescence was associated with lower VO2 peak in young adulthood, and higher MBPA and VPA in adolescence were associated with higher VO2 peak in young adulthood. Engaging in VPA during adolescence was further associated with favorable changes in visceral fat mass, insulin levels, and a clustered cardiometabolic risk score in young adulthood. The relationship of MBPA and VPA with clustered cardiometabolic risk might be modified by childhood BMI tertiles, where we found that those in the highest BMI tertile demonstrated a more favorable association than those in the lower 2 tertiles. Finally, onto the last paper in my PhD. This paper is titled Tracking of Device-Measured Sedentary Time, Cardiorespiratory Fitness, and Cardiometabolic Risk Factors from Childhood to Young Adulthood. Right now, this paper is still in manuscript. It underwent a review process at epidemiology, but was unfortunately rejected after review. The paper will be resubmitted to another journal as soon as possible. This paper made use of the same multiply imputed dataset that was used for paper 3, and the analysis were performed separately for each sex. Here are the tracking of the 368 males eligible for participation in the PANCS follow-up. I will try to guide you through these tables as well. First, BMI exhibited strong tracking from childhood to adulthood, to young adulthood. Moderate tracking was observed for waist circumference, absolute and relative VO2 peak, systolic blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, and the clustered cardiometabolic risk score. Weak to no tracking was found for sedentary time, insulin, and high sensitivity CRP, which is a measure of low-grade inflammation in the body. Of note, the clustered cardiometabolic risk score demonstrated a tracking magnitude in the higher end of moderate in terms of stability coefficients, where we also can see that those in the least favorable quartile at age 9 were over five times more likely to be in this quartile at age 24 as compared to those belonging to any other quartile at baseline. Here is the corresponding table for the 340 females eligible for participation in the PANCS follow-up. Both BMI and waist circumference demonstrated strong tracking from childhood to young adulthood. Moderate tracking was found for absolute and relative VO2 peak, LDL cholesterol, and the clustered cardiometabolic risk score. Weak to no tracking was observed for sedentary time, systolic blood pressure, insulin, and high sensitivity CRP. Similar to males, the clustered cardiometabolic risk score demonstrated tracking in the higher half of moderate in terms of stability coefficients, where we also found that those in the least favorable quartile at age 9 was almost 6 times more likely to be in this quartile at age 24 as compared to those belonging to any other quartile at baseline. So for a summary, paper 4, several established risk factors for developing CVD demonstrated moderate to strong tracking from childhood to young adulthood, including BMI, waist circumference, VO2 peak, absolute and relative, LDL cholesterol, and a clustered cardiometabolic risk score. Systolic blood pressure demonstrated moderate to weak tracking, while weak to no tracking was observed for sedentary time, insulin, and high sensitivity CRP. Tracking magnitude was largely similar between males and females. However, females demonstrated somewhat stronger tracking of waist circumference, while VO2 peak tracked stronger among males. The high stability of several established cardiometabolic risk factors already from childhood implies that early intervention may be necessary to stop further development. However, risk factors of high stability may not be easily changed, and sedentary time could be an easier target than more stable risk factors. This was a short summary of the 4 papers constituting this thesis. Of course, as in all research, they were not without their limitations, which I'm sure we will cover in the next few hours. I would also like to thank everyone who has contributed to the PANCS studies over the years, and thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you very much for a comprehensive presentation of the summarizing the results and the setting of your doctoral thesis. And for the faculty, thank you for the invitation to act a member in this evaluation committee. And with Professor Twisk, we have shared the work in this session so that Professor Twisk will cover more detail in the methodology and statistics, and the content in general will be covered by me first. So I'm happy to begin. And yes, I have just prepared some slides as well, just to make it easier to audience to follow. That we are talking about the same slides, yes. And these are just copies from the dissertation directly, nothing new. Yes. And yeah, but as a first question, I would like to know, how did you end up to work with this topic? how did you select this topic, and or did the select topic you sometimes may happen in this kind of processes?
Well, it may be that the topic selected me somehow, because I applied for a PhD position here. I had been a student here before. So at the time when I applied, I knew that I was going to work with something related to youth, sedentary time perhaps. It was a part of a bigger project, but I didn't know at the time that this was the project that I was going to work on. But it was something that we talked about quite early, and it also seemed like a very interesting project, so I was definitely interested right away. But it was probably a bit of a coincidence, I would say, that I ended up doing exactly this. Yeah.
And it has been a longitudinal study, and several decisions has been made before you have come to the research group, and I would like to ask you to describe about your role in the realization of the study. So, did you have opportunity to participate in data collection or opportunity to participate in planning the latest measurements or data collection?
I was not involved in PANCS 1 or PANCS 2, I mean the first two studies. PANCS 1, I was still in high school. But the second one, I was a student here, but I was not involved in that. But I was very involved in the follow-up study now. When they were 24 years of age, I was the project coordinator, and I started out with a lot of the logistics and having contact with the participants, getting them in, planning these logistics, all from traveling and booking of the rooms and testing procedures. And I also did a quick course on taking blood samples, because it made me much more flexible, because then I could do it on my own. So I was heavily involved in all aspects of the data collection of the follow-up studies. I also had some very good help from someone sitting here. But most of the study had already been planned out before I started. So we had some opportunities to modify things, but it was already a project that was thought out before I started here. Yeah.
Is that's the way it's commonly is in this kind of impressive longitudinal study with a lot of data collection and different kind of measurements, but it's great that you have had opportunity to meet the participants and do some data collection. You really get the different approach to the topic by doing hands-off.
Yeah, it's weird. I feel like I know the data set a little better because I know I have met the participants somehow.
Yes. And yes, absolutely. And when we look at the title, there are certain terms that it's always important to define in this kind of scientific writing and scientific discussions. And I think you did very well this morning during the trial lecture. You defined the major terms, and in the thesis you have also defined the major terms well. And was there any terms that you were thinking, are you using this or some other terms, or?
I guess cardiorespiratory fitness. We may as well could have called it VO2 max, but I mean it's a broader and more, I don't know, perhaps recognizable term. Or maybe not. VO2 max is also.
So it was quite straightforward.
Yeah.
And yes, I like the use of terms throughout the doctoral thesis. Sometimes you talk about cardiometabolic risk factors, and sometimes you mentioned that risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So what is the relationship between this, or is there difference, or are there overlapping cardiometabolic risk and cardiovascular risks?
I feel personally when I read about this that they are to a large degree used among each other. I mean, it's quite a similarity. But to me, cardiometabolic risk factors is a wider term. It includes several different risk factors. Yes. So, for example, I mean, cardiovascular to me is more of the heart and the vessels in the body, yes. While the metabolic system to me becomes a wider term. So cardiometabolic risk factors to me is a wider term than the cardiovascular risk factors. Yeah. But I have to say that every time I read about the cardiovascular risk factors, they're pretty much the same as the cardiometabolic risk factors. Yes. So I'm not sure whether I can say that there's a huge difference in practicality, but in theory maybe.
Yes, I agree and have the same kind of thinking about this. Yeah. But what kind, if you did certain variables, what would you use if you have cardiovascular disease, and then if you add some variables that make it to be cardiometabolic risk factors in this study? Is there some certain aspects?
Yeah, I mean, well, for me, traditional cardiovascular risk factors involves blood pressure, cholesterol, some measure of the carbohydrate metabolism, either glucose or insulin, and of course obesity, which are like the major traditional. And I guess VO2 max probably is a term more related to the metabolic part, but still also a very strong predictor of cardiovascular disease. Yeah,
and it's not so strictly defined, and different researchers use it in a different way, but I think in the same way. And sometimes insulin and glucose values have been used like for cardiometabolic risk factors. And in this study, you focus on health behavior. You focus on physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness. Is there some other lifestyle risk factors that associate with atherosclerotic processes?
That I have not looked at, you mean?
Just in general.
Yeah, of course. I mean, diets, of course.
Yes.
Smoking, of course. Yes. Alcohol consumption. Yeah, but that's strongly related, of course, to diet. So I mean, diet, of course, would be something very strongly related to these risk factors that I have not looked into details on.
Yes, it's really important to understand that these lifestyle factors are maybe in medicine much more often recognized compared to physical activity and physical activity. So this kind of research is very important to that area still. Yeah. Yes, very good, very good. And so we are talking about risk factors. These are young people, and at the age of 24, were there some diseases already recognized or diagnosed in this target population? Do you have information on that? It was not the direct aim, but
in the questionnaires, they could reply if they had any diagnostic disease, but no, I don't think there were any established diseases, at least not in a cardiovascular sense, and not making it difficult for them to be physically active in any kind of way. But I think, if I don't remember wrong, that just short of 10% of them could be defined as having metabolic syndrome in terms of the, I believe it was the diabetes, international diabetes guidelines for metabolic syndrome. And I think, so I mean, several of these are probably in the risk area of developing cardiovascular disease when they get older. But of course, they're in an age where it's difficult to talk about risk because they are really healthy in general. But then again, of course, for those 8 or 9%, I think it was, who had the metabolic syndrome, of course, they could really do with doing some changes.
Yes. And yes, thank you. And if you continue this kind of longitudinal study, when would you expect the prevalence of cardiovascular diseases increase approximately? No need to
I
know.
mean, I wouldn't say until after 50 at least, and probably also from 60 onwards.
Yeah, that's common understanding. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So I think, I think at least 50 years, and then maybe also from 60. In terms of them actually being really or getting cardiovascular diseases diagnosed. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Okay, and you are talking about different cardiovascular separate risk factors, but you are also talking about clustering of cardiometabolic risk factors. Yeah. Why is it important? Why is clustering of?
Well, I mean, it's been observed, over the last 40 years, I guess, so that when you have one risk factor, and maybe particular if you are obese, you tend to also have a few of the other risk factors. And there have been a few longitudinal studies that have seen that if you have this kind of clustering of risk factors, these not only individually increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, they also synergistically work together to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. Yeah. So, and that's also why metabolic syndrome were thought of, to identify early these individuals who are at risk both of type 2 diabetes and later cardiovascular disease.
Yes, very, very good, and I think it was a good solution to also has this clustered risk as an outcome in this study, in addition to these other separate single risk factors. Yes. What about if you had a group of children, adolescents, and you would like to predict their cardiometabolic risk, and you could use only one measure, one variable you have to choose. Yeah. Which would you choose, and which would be the most predictable risk factor?
BMI.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, it gets a lot of criticism, and perhaps rightfully so, because it's not a measure of body fat, but it is an excellent predictor of cardiometabolic risk. Yeah. And it tracks really well, and all it needs is your height and weight measurements. And I think there was a study from Finland where they saw that you could see already from age 8 or 5, I believe, that the diabetes, that is clustering of risk factors, predicted metabolic syndrome in adulthood. But BMI alone had the same predictive power as the clustering of these other risk factors. Yeah. So I believe if I could only choose one, I would choose BMI. I mean, of course, in an ideal world, you could probably choose something else, but in a practical sense, it can be done, and it's two very common and easy measurements that's needed to get BMI.
Yes, to be used in the population level and maybe to recognize those who would benefit most, like these physical activity interventions.
And also, I mean, of course, waist circumference could also, when you first measure height and weight, you could always include waist circumference. But I feel that it's slightly more prone to error, because it's not always that easy to know exactly where to measure the waist circumference, while height and weight is very, very easy.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And about the measurements and about physical activity measurements, for this work you have a limited literature to studies that had used device-based measurements of physical activity.
Yeah.
And are you happy with this narrowing this area, or
in terms of the physical activity measurements?
Yes, when we think about the literature and earlier studies
and what's been done before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not that it's not being done before, that you've measured from childhood to adolescence, and there's also been from adolescence to young adulthood, some studies of that, but I haven't seen anyone doing the three measurements, both in childhood and in adolescence and in young adulthood. So I guess I was quite happy with us being able to do that, although the results wasn't exactly how we thought they would be, because we thought they would be less active also from 15 to 24. But I mean, that was very interesting to see something that we may not expected. Yeah.
Yes, I agree and think in the same way that it was very wise to narrow the measurements for this purpose.
Yeah.
And otherwise the literature would be very, very wide and not so focused for this topic. And did you use also questionnaires in your study to measure self-reported physical activity?
Well, we use questionnaires, but not in the sense of not a validated questionnaire for measuring physical activity, but more in terms of perhaps correlates or determinants or habits surrounding physical activity. Yeah. Not
physical activity levels or amount of physical activity. Yeah.
No, not in that way. No.
Okay. And, yes, and that's really a new topic. And as you mentioned, there was a gap in the literature between about these follow-up studies for this age range. So that kind of information was needed and maybe still needed.
It's probably still needed a bit more, yes.
Yes. Yes. Device-based physical activity and use of accelerometers.
Yeah.
What do you think? What are the benefits and what are the limitations in this kind of epidemiological study?
Well, I mean, the benefits is, of course, that it is a certain way around the recall bias problem of questionnaires, because they pick up acceleration when it arrives and doesn't when you're not moving. But I mean, one thing is, of course, it's not optimal for all types of activities. It's good for habitual physical activity, walking in everyday life, which is most of the physical activity that most of us do. But for example, if I have it on my hip or even on my wrist, and I do bicycling, for example, it's not going to pick up the correct amount of acceleration in terms of the intensity that I use on the activity. So it's not bulletproof for every type of activity, but in general, for general purpose use, I think it's a very good tool. But also, of course, you have the question about what type of cut points should you use to define light physical activity, moderate physical activity, vigorous physical activity. And there are so many of them. And honestly, when I look at them, how different they can be, it makes me think that, it makes me question how valid can this measurement be, because two different researchers can use two different kind of cut points, and both rooted in the literature, but get very different results on the same measurements, because the cut points can be so different.
Yes.
So of course that is a weakness, although I tend to see that most literature who has used device-based method in youth, at least in the last decade or so, I feel like I see the Evensen cut points used a lot, so at least there might be some harmony there, but suddenly you see something else, and suddenly the cut point for VPA is at 6,000 counts per minute and not 4,000 counts per minute, and that will of course affect the results.
Yeah. Did you consider to use the other cut points?
Yeah.
For adults, for instance?
I did do that. I did an analysis where I used the Evensen cut points at 9 and 15 and the Troiano cut points, I think it was, for adults at age 24, which basically what it does is that it's a slightly lower threshold for moderate physical activity. I think the threshold goes from 2,296 and down towards 2,000. And the threshold for VPA gets much higher with the Troiano cut points. So of course that led to some changes. It's difficult to say what's the right choice, because when you measure something over time and you suddenly change cut points, it begs the question of did this behavior change because you changed cut points, or did their behavior actually change? So I preferred to keep the same cut points at all age points, not only because I felt that it was most coherent, but because it also was most in line with the measurement of total physical activity in terms of counts per minute, because this measurement is independent of these types of cut points. And we saw that there was a substantial decrease from 9 to 15 in total physical activity, and then there was only a minor decrease from 15 to 24 years old, which was very in line with the answers we got with the Evensen cut points. With the Troiano cut points, the MVPA cut point would have been lower, so there would have been more people achieving MVPA. So we saw that when using Troiano, MVPA had the same substantial decrease from 9 to 15, but then it went a bit up again to 24 when we used the Troiano cut points.
Yes, and I agree with you that it was a good decision to use the same cut points and focus on the phenomenon itself, not the change of the cut points during the longitudinal setting. And you told that you had some challenges during the latest measurement, and because of COVID pandemic, and it may affect the participants who were not able to come to the measurements or were not willing to come to the measurements. And I would like to ask about what do you think about physical activity? May this kind of pandemic have some effects on physical activity levels of participants? Possibly, we don't maybe know, but do you have any?
I mean, first of all, it was a challenging because all measurements were done here, except that, of course, they got the accelerometer with them and used for 7 consecutive days. But we needed them to get to Oslo, and for the ones that was located either in Oslo or close to Oslo, it was generally less of a problem.
Yeah.
But as soon as we got to perhaps the west coast, the middle of of Norway, or up north,
Yeah.
they were skeptical of coming here during the COVID-19 pandemic, and much of that, I believe, had to do with, I mean, Oslo was the epicenter, and many didn't want to come to Oslo during this time. But on the other hand, these were 24, 25. They weren't really that scared of the virus. Or maybe that's the wrong wording, but it wasn't, they weren't necessarily, they didn't think that it was going to be lethal to them to get this virus. So I believe, I felt like they were more willing to come to Oslo than if we had studied older adults, for example. And then we probably wouldn't have done it because it would have been an ethical consideration and probably would have had to put it on hold. But no, it was definitely a challenge. And the further we moved away from Oslo, the more skeptical they were. And it was a very common reason that they cited to us why they didn't want to come was because of COVID, and that they didn't want to come to Oslo. So of course, under other circumstances, I do believe that 258 during this time is quite good. I think that we would have reached the 400 that we were aiming for under normal circumstances, but of course I can't know that. But that's my feeling. What goes for the physical activity level? I know I've seen some studies that perhaps the behaviors changed, but that the overall levels, at least in Norway, didn't change all that much.
Were the universities, were they open? Were schools open? Or were they distance work?
If I remember correctly, the first 6 months, there was almost a complete shutdown of everything. I mean, we could be here, but there was so strict rules about everything. All lectures were digital. So no, most of the society was shut down during the first 6 months. And during that period as well, we didn't do much data collection because that was the first, very first period of COVID-19. So that put the entire project on hold for about 6 months.
Okay, maybe after lockdown, it didn't have so much effect on habitual physical activity.
No, maybe. And if it had any effect, I believe, then especially that first 6 months, because it was so restrained what we could do. But then on the other hand, some found joy in going out and doing exercises that maybe weren't used to doing that. So I think it could have been polarized. Maybe those who were active got even more active, but I can also believe that those who already were sedentary became even more sedentary because they were locked up at home.
Maybe. Yes. Yes, this is the list of publications, and thanks for the update of the status of the two other papers as well. And it's typical that when you target to high-quality journal, it may take time, but it's very good to see. It was very good to see that the two first articles were published in high-quality journals in this area. Yes. And candidate has been the leading author, first author in the all articles. So it's showing big role in this entity. Yes, and you began with the review article, and I think it's an excellent way to begin the doctoral thesis, to make a systematic review and learn how to do it. And we also discussed with our committee earlier today that we were impressed about your trial lecture and how you were able to prepare it in quite a short time and you also made systematic literature review and also meta-analysis for that. And this all shows that you have learned good skills for academic research during the process. And it's a big benefit later on. And did this first article review, did it affect the other papers or settings, or did it change thinking, or
No.
was it just work going on at the same time, or?
Well, it didn't. I mean, I had already kind of decided the papers that I wanted to write from the PANCS follow-up study, so it didn't really change in that sense. But it made me also investigate whether cardiorespiratory fitness modified the associations in paper 3, which it didn't, but BMI modified it. So it's still a question of, is it so that physical activity is most beneficial among those who may need it the most? And so that needs to be investigated further.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and when I read the thesis, and I read Article 3, and I noticed that you have done this kind of subgroup analysis, and but I would have maybe expected a more clear presentation of the results related to cardiorespiratory fitness as well. You mentioned that it's not. There was no this kind of modifying effect, but and you presented the results for body mass index, but not for cardiorespiratory fitness. And of course, I know it's the length of the manuscript, and you have to shorten a bit. But what I was thinking that may this kind of that you leave out the non-significant results, may that lead to some kind of publication bias, or
Absolutely. I mean, and we did investigate quite a few categorical variables to see if they modified the relationships. So in the end, only BMI showed anything, and strictly due to a lack of space in the article, we only showed that. However, because this paper, when it's submitted to a different journal, it's out of context of my thesis.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
They don't know that I've done this systematic review first.
Yes.
But in the thesis, of course, I could have shown more. I could have expanded the results.
Maybe some additional
in the thesis.
analysis.
I could have done that, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I did all those analyses and they were available.
Yeah.
I just thought that maybe it was too much and that maybe I should just describe it in text.
Yes. A good solution would be maybe to do that. Add into the.
Yeah, because I could definitely have included it in the thesis, because it would have made more sense there, because this was more a part of a story in the thesis of the 4 papers. It's not that easy to understand for a reader in a different journal that why I would include the results of cardiorespiratory fitness, but maybe not some other results that weren't significant.
Yes. Yes, thanks. And here are some pictures and tables from the review, and so if you add your own third study into this table, where would it be, and what would be the direction of the arrow for that study?
I mean, it would be similar to this at the bottom. It's a prospective study. It would be, of course, baseline age, yeah, quite similar.
Yeah.
Assessment of PA, very similar. CRF, not the same because we used a direct VO2 max. But otherwise, it would be very similar to that one, except that the finding, of course, is not the same. We would have a horizontal arrow, meaning no effect modification of that particular variable.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And it was also important and, of course, necessary also to make this kind of risk of bias assessments for this kind of systematic review. And in general, I like very much for the visualization you have used to make it easier for the reader. Like in this table, it's very simple to use those arrows. It's easy to check it quickly.
Yeah.
How many studies are significant and non-significant, and the direction of the association, and the same for this risk of bias assessment. And can you shortly describe about, this is for these observational studies, that you have used a special quality assessment tool for observational cohort and cross-sectional studies, quality assessment tool.
Yeah.
And just shortly, what kind of issues you check when you do this kind of quality assessment
so
for the studies? Yeah.
In this tool, it's selection bias, information bias, confounding, and temporality. It's only those 4 domains actually, because the EMA is a separate domain that we added for the effect modification analysis from a separate instrument called Iceman, which we did after review because the reviewers wanted us to do that.
Yeah.
So the selection bias, of course, is it's pretty much related, and information they can be strong, of course, in this regard. But when we assess this, it's about what they have written in their papers. Yeah. So that's all we can do to try to evaluate the quality. What I can say was that it was very clear that confounding was either often, or the adjustment of was either often inadequate or it was very poorly described. Yeah. Temporality was very easy to assess, of course, because if it's a cross-sectional, we automatically gave it a high risk of bias.
Yeah. And thanks. And when you think about the third study, and if you get that published, and when you will get that published, and someone would like to update this review for you, and take the latest literature, yes, and would your paper end up to this systematic review? What do you think?
I think, do you mean if someone rated my study in terms of the risk of bias assessment?
Yes, and if you think about the literature search strategy
I believe that we would have received some risk of bias in my study. I believe that what I cannot answer is, there were 708 eligible participants, 258 participated. Who were these participants as compared to those who didn't participate? It's very hard for us to answer that question. However, we are fortunate in that we have so many measured variables, in that this missing at random assumption, which they call it, it makes more sense the more variables you have, because then maybe missing data can be explained by your observed data. And the more observed data you have, the more likely it is that this assumption is true. So I believe that we managed it as well as we could, but it couldn't have gotten a high assessment in the selection part. And information, maybe a green one, confounding, maybe yellow. We could have, someone would probably have asked for inclusion of diet as a factor. Although I'm not sure strictly how strong a confounder diet would be here. I'm not sure diet is directly related to, for example, physical activity.
Yeah.
Will your diet affect your physical activity level? So maybe it would go through something like obesity. And if you then already controls for obesity, I'm not sure. I believe we would have gotten a yellow overall rating, as some risk of bias.
Yeah.
I don't think we would have gotten a high risk of bias, mainly due to the design that we have. But of course, there are always some limitations. I believe that we may be quite similar to Skredo.
Yes, thank you for this analysis, and I'm happy for this answer. It's always good to look at your own works as well, what kind of bias there may be, and yes, and as you mentioned that the number of participants decreased up to 24-year-old study, and what was the participation rate in general at the age of 24? Those who were
what was that again? Like 36%? Can that be right?
Yes. Was it the same for males and females?
No.
Was it?
That's one of the factors.
Yeah.
Females was more likely to participate.
It's more likely.
More likely.
Yes.
Males were more likely to drop out, because both at age 9 and 15 there were more males included in the studies than females, but there were more females now at 24. So they were more they were easier to recruit than the males. So that was one of the factors that we saw a difference in.
Yes.
Yeah.
And okay. What about if you look at these physical activity figures, and when you think about females and males at the age of 24, is there difference in that in general about tracking of physical activity, or?
Yeah, I mean the physical activity levels between females and males were quite similar at age 24.
Yeah.
It was not very similar at 9 and 15, because males were more active than females, both at age 9 and 15. But at age 24, it had evened out, and even to such an extent that females actually were slightly more active than the males. But in terms of sex differences at age 24, it was not really big, but they were actually quite similar.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the figures like this, and the next figure you have done to visualize the data, and in the text you mentioned that some of these findings were not expected, a bit exceptional maybe.
Yeah.
And for instance, if we look at this interaction between sex and MVPA, and if you look at the gender difference here, and for me somehow it looks like that maybe males are it's working like in the same way as in earlier studies, maybe expected, but for females it may be something exceptional. I'm
not sure, and that's one thing. I mean, we've seen before in the UngKan studies in Norway, the young adults, often the females are slightly more active than the males. So that in itself is not exceptional. It's just maybe weird how it has evolved over time. I think it's weird both the oxygen uptake at baseline and body mass index at baseline. I mean, these are two classical variables that maybe, if you get a child that's low fit and high BMI, you'd predict this child perhaps to be an inactive adult, although that's not right here at all. The ones in the highest baseline BMI tertiles, well, they had the lowest levels of MVPA, both at 9 and 15, but somehow now they had the highest level at age 24, which I mean may be a good thing, of course, because then you're not, even if you're at the upper tertile of BMI, you can still be active as a young adult. And the same for peak oxygen uptake.
Yes, I was thinking that, can it be so that maybe a group of ladies who have been involved in the study at the age of 15 years, who have been quite inactive and maybe has had a low, maybe also low peak VO2 and had a bit high body mass index. What about if they have part of them have inspired to be more physical activity and be more physically active, and they saw that now I have opportunity to get to measurements, direct measurements of.
Yeah.
Just thinking about the
maybe they were more motivated. It could be. There are so many questions about this that I just cannot get the answer to.
Yes.
But I've been thinking about this, of course, a lot over the past few years. But it also makes me think that what happens between age 15 and 24 is a really defining moment in how active they are at age 24 or in your 20s. So one is that maybe this transition between being a young man at home, living under my parents' roof, to moving out, being independent, maybe economically independent, getting a girlfriend, and so on. Maybe that change is formative of how physically active you are, at least in your 20s. And it might also be that your 20s is the exception. Maybe it's a strange decade. Many things are about to fall in line or in place during your 20s. You're studying, you're getting your first job, maybe you're get your first child, and so on. So while 9 and 15 weren't really predictive here of physical activity at age 24, maybe it will be at age 34, maybe it will be at 44 or 50. Maybe things have changed again. Maybe the 20s is an anomaly. I'm not sure.
Yes, this is of course just speculation, and I'm very happy that you have been also thinking about this and possible selection. But I think that you have described the sample at the age of 24 and the dropouts and all the comparisons very well and very openly in the doctoral dissertation, as well as you can do. I really appreciate that it's so openly described, that also reviewers can try to make their own conclusions as well. Yes. Okay. So, and if you have an opportunity to continue this longitudinal study, and you get an offer from a foundation that it was a great doctoral thesis, we offer opportunity to make follow-up again. What would be a good timing for you for this study, and what would you measure? One time point and
I think in 10 years' time would be a good timing. Once every decade. It must be feasible as well, so I don't think too often is feasible, but in a decade's time, I would also measure probably the same variables as we did now. There was a kind of a limitation for us at age 15. That was slightly different because there were only anthropometric measures and accelerometry that we got included in PANCS 2 at age 15. So it made some types of analysis for us a bit hard because we didn't have every variable measured at 3 time points. Some were only measured at 9 and 24. Or many were actually measured at only 9 and 24. So I would definitely try to have a rich data collection again, as many variables as I possibly could have been allowed to collect, because you never know when you might need them, but certainly at least the same that we had now.
And who would you invite to this next follow-up study?
Of participants, you mean?
Those who have participated in 24?
I would try to seek out the 731 again, because I think we are allowed to contact them. So I would keep this as a larger group as possible. I would not now continue only with 258. At the very least, I would try to continue with the 708 that was eligible. But no, I would stick to the cohort size of 731.
A bit bigger cohort, yes.
So even though maybe we only had 258 now, if we get 500 at the next time point, it would still be very interesting data.
Okay, I think we have gone through the general, quite many general questions, and we can maybe have go to statistics, but maybe we will have a break before that. Yes.
And let's take 10 minutes break and return with the second opponent.
When you turn it off?
Yes.
also a little late, like people in the south of Europe.
Well, I'm not sure whether I have I need an hour. It depends a bit on the questions, on the answers. If he answers very quickly, very fast. Sorry.
Hæ?
Det var ikke sikkert, at han havde brug for en time.
Perfekt.
So now we will continue with the second opponent. Please take your seats.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me over to be part of the ceremony. I really enjoy it, and I also really enjoyed your thesis. The reason why I really enjoyed it is that when I did my PhD thesis a long time ago, it was more or less the same topic. It was about tracking, it was about cardiovascular disease risk factors, longitudinal studies. So it really felt like a sort of, again, but, you know, so it's nice. And I first want to congratulate you with this thesis because I really enjoyed it and I think it's very nice work. And what I also like, because I moved a bit from exercise physiology into statistics. Yeah. And you really you used nice methods, and I always like that when people try to use new methods to analyze the data. And so, there was a lot of discussion, I think, about those stuff. So I really want to discuss with you some of the methods you used. And I have a bit of it's a bit of a mess, so I hope I can ask you everything, but I will try. And if I can't find my questions anymore, then we can also discuss football, because we have the same passion in football. I really I like football very, very much. And you like it as well. So, but do. Luckily, Holland is a bit better than Norway, so that's nice.
Unfortunately.
But, well, if I don't find my questions anymore, we can continue about football. So we will definitely need 1.5 hours, something like that. Anyway, I organized my questions a bit by your papers. So let's start with the first one. That makes sense, I guess. And what you use a lot of things by Van der Wele. And I really have to say that I read some of his papers, but I don't understand much of it, because I don't know, the way he writes it is, for me, it's a bit complicated. So I have a few questions around the papers of Van der Wele and the methods you used. The first one is in your review, you mentioned that Van der Wele says that effect modification and interaction are different things. Yeah. And, well, you have to know, I teach undergraduate students, I teach master students, and I always tell them that effect modification and interaction is exactly the same. So, obviously, I'm wrong.
No.
So, maybe you can explain why it's different, and what's the difference between the two, because I really don't understand.
Well, we didn't write that in our first version of this paper. Okay. But we met a reviewer, which was very insistent on that, and he had written he or she suggested that we cite that particular paper and explained why they are different things. And that paper is quite complicated. If it's that one you think about, then I think he has some other paper where he writes understandable, but that one is really complicated. And honestly, a test of effect modification is a formal, you include an interaction term in your model. So I would never have included that, because to me that was more confusing than anything else.
Okay. So we are on the same line.
We are exactly,
Okay, that's
we
always
are
great
in
to hear.
agreement. Yeah.
So I don't have to change everything.
No,
Okay, that's
absolutely
great.
not.
That's great. So there is basically no difference. I thought that was no difference because
I-
what you say,
I-
you know,
I
you put in an
couldn't-
interaction term in the model, and that's how you test for.
I guess an effect modification is a specific kind of interaction. I mean, you have to test, for example, an association across different levels. So maybe one of the variables should be categorical.
Yeah. Okay.
But
But
I'm
it's
not,
not
su-
necessary,
I'm
actually.
not
You can
sure.
also have
I'm sure
continuous variable
it doesn't really need to be because
No.
we also included the interactions of continuous variables in this
Yeah.
review.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but in the classical sense, the way that at least Van der Wiel talks about effect modification is difference between stratas of another variable.
Yeah. Okay. Something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, now the problem with reviewers is that they want to add something to the paper you
Yes.
don't want, and
Yeah.
because we all want to publish stuff, we have to do it.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
shouldn't be that way, but that's normally how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Another question about the systematic review, because you looked at effect modification.
Yeah.
And what I always do is do effect modification as a sort of additional thing in
Yeah.
research.
Yeah.
And so I wonder why you chose effect modification as your main topic and not something like, because there are other mechanisms as well that you can figure out
Yeah.
for physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness,
Yeah.
like mediation or something. And
Yeah.
so why did you look at effect modification and not things like mediation or maybe the other way around? You know, there are several pathways to think about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this was a kind of an invited review. I believe Ulf received it, and where we wanted to update.
You're to blame.
Not for that particular, but they wanted an update of the review of the relationship between physical activity, physical fitness, and in children and youth from 2001, I believe. But we had the freedom to do as we wanted within that
Certain
area.
limits. Yeah.
And not long before that, I believe one of Ulf's PhD students found exactly that CRF modified the relationship between, it's actually one of the studies included here, the one longitudinal study that we could find on this, found that CRF modified this relationship. But we didn't know of many other studies on this topic, so that's how it came about that maybe we should do a systematic literature review on that particular topic, because we don't really know how this mechanism works.
Yeah. And you were not, but you were not capable of doing a sort of meta-analysis to see different effect sizes for different groups or something like that?
They were so different, and we also opted to both intervention studies and observational studies, and the way that they reported results were so different. So we had to be very liberal. I mean, include also things that were only stated in text, for example, which means that we had no information from that text about effect sizes. So it would have been a much smaller review, much fewer studies, because not many studies, or of course some would have done, but not many studies actually reported what we would have needed to do a meta-analysis. So no, I mean, I would have preferred that, because I do find it easier to interpret a meta-analysis.
And then you get some idea about how strong the effects are. And now it's just the arrows, and you can see positive, negative, or whatever.
And now we also included which direction it was reported, completely ignoring then whether it was the p-value really. But we wanted to do that also because we didn't only want to rely on a sort of a decomatization of like statistical significant or not. So we wanted to take the direction into account to make it slightly more nuanced, but of course a meta-analysis would have given us much more information.
Yeah, of course. But I've also wondered, because you have significant effect modification, non-significant effect modification, and no effect modification.
Yeah.
And to be honest, if I write down something about effect modification and there is no significant effect modification, I always write down in the paper one line, there was no significant effect modification, etc. And nothing else. So how did you decide whether or not it's no significant effect modification or non-significant effect modification? What's the difference?
Well, it was much easier in the papers who reported their results in details, of course, because then we could see whether, for example, an association differed between two groups and that it was just that this was not statistically non-significant. In that case, we would call it a non-significant effect modification because we clearly saw that the groups differed.
Yeah.
It was probably just a sub-analysis of an already underpowered analysis.
Well,
so that they
the problem with effect modification.
So that's or they explicitly perhaps gave us some information in text that we could use. But most likely, or most often, it was that they had been detailed in their reporting of their analysis.
Did you also contact the authors sometimes to see to get some more information?
No, but actually we did exclude some papers because we didn't get enough information.
Okay.
But maybe we should have contacted them instead because
I tried it once, but don't do it.
Doesn't work.
You never get an answer.
Okay.
Almost never get an answer. Yeah. Well, about significance testing, in the discussion you state something nice, I guess, or I think, and I quote you. In an attempt to create a more nuanced picture of the findings, we decided to not only consider statistical significance, but to take the direction of the estimates into account. Well, I can't more agree to do that because I like that. But then you say, although a more nuanced picture indeed is provided by including the direction of non-significant results, the rate of type 1 errors would certainly increase with the current approach as compared to more conservative methods. And then I think, then you lost me a bit, because type 1 errors are based on testing theory. Yeah. And so if you first say that you don't look really at significant p-values, so you don't use testing theory in your conclusions or in your in evaluating the estimates, and then next you say that you have a problem with type 1 errors, which is also statistical testing. So I don't really understand.
No, I believe what I meant by that is that maybe with this type of approach, although more nuanced, maybe we will put a lot of weight on findings that maybe aren't real, meaning that we have put some weight on some findings that turns out to be, maybe we shouldn't have taken that direction into account. Maybe it wasn't that way when we did the study again. Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe there are a lot of uncertainty in these studies. But I guess that was my only point by that. I do believe that we shouldn't look at p-values too strictly in terms of a threshold, even though I have done it in all my papers, and it seems like it's expected from all the reviewers. But I definitely prefer to look at the point estimate and then take the confidence interval into account to assess uncertainty. So about the sentence of type 1 errors, I guess I'm not really sure what I thought about that, other than that it came vaguely to my mind that it could be by this type of very open approach that we put too much weight on findings that maybe are not real.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But do you want to get rid of significance, p-values, and get rid of saying something about statistical significance, or not?
I don't need it. For me, we could easily get rid of the statistical significant quote or not. Yes. I do believe we should emphasize, but we could easily keep the p-values. We could report an association, for example. We could report the confidence interval and the exact p-value, but it doesn't need to be in relationship with, for example, it's significant if it's less than 0.05. I mean, that part for me can easily be go away. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you say that. Maybe I'm not glad that you say that, because otherwise we could have a very nice discussion about this, because I really want to get rid of the p-values, and I wrote some papers about it, and I tried to convince a lot of people to get rid of the p-values exactly because what you said.
Yeah.
So on one hand, I'm very glad that you say that.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, therefore the discussion ends now. But it's really, I think exactly the same. I think the p-value is much too overrated.
Yeah.
And, or not really the p-value, but significant yes or no. And it's, I don't think we really have a dichotomy in our research. It's just you have to look at effect estimates and look at relevance of effect estimates. And I can't more agree with you.
And it has so little information, for example, compared to a confidence interval. I mean, the p-value in itself gives you so little information to assess.
Yeah. No, true, totally true. A bit further, I don't understand something in your discussion of that paper.
Yeah.
You say there that to avoid biased results from effect modification analysis, one generally cannot use effect modifiers that condition on the exposure itself. From the Whalen 2009. Can you explain that for me?
Good question. I mean, that paper, as I said, was complicated. But if I remember, you cannot use a effect modification indicator that condition on the
exposure. So it cannot be related to the exposure. I don't understand it because I think in your paper as well, a lot of cardiorespiratory fitness as an effect modifier for physical activity, they are highly related to each other.
They are, I remember now. It's been some years since that paper. But yeah, I remember there was a concern among the reviewers that physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness were too closely related, and cited that paper on this.
Again.
So we argued that they are these variables. I mean, CRF and habitual physical activity often have a correlation coefficient of less than 0.3. So statistically, I don't think that these variables were highly associated.
Correlated, no. Now, maybe it's a bit of collinearity or something like that. That you mean something like that?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. But because I think in a lot of situations, there is a relationship between the effect modifiers and the exposure. Yeah. Which makes sense, I guess, because it's not that big a problem.
Agreed.
And maybe it means that something like collinearity, because collinearity can be a problem, I think.
Yeah, at least in a regression model.
True.
But that was also actually, that was a response to the reviewer. And maybe we were, I mean, we got the sense that we wanted to please the reviewer, I guess.
That's the way it works, you know.
Yeah.
We rely too much on publications in our field, I guess. Yeah. And then you have something to do like that. Okay, anyway, let's move on to the next one. And it's not that when I'm at paper 4 that I can come back to paper 1 again, so no, probably not. You use mixed models in the second paper, which I like because I give courses in mixed modeling and that sort of stuff, so I really like mixed models. But I didn't really understand what you did, because you also have a school level, I guess. And then you said, so you have a nested random intercept at an individual level within schools at 8 to 9 years. And then I think you mean that you define school level at 9 years, and that's the second random intercept or something like that. And you have a random intercept on individual level. And then that's clear to me, if it's true. And then you say, if model singularity became an issue, the complexity of the random factors was reduced to a random intercept at school level. Yeah. That I don't understand, because then you get rid of the random intercept on individual level, or not?
If that term, I don't think it became an issue probably when we looked into these subgroup analysis, which I didn't really get into. You mean like females and males tracking and 15 to 24 versus 9 to 15. Then this happened. But yes, we used at least in our what is called a nested random intercept, and that means that you have a random intercept, and you tell the model basically that these participants are grouped on an individual level, meaning that their IDs mean that they are group leveled on the individual level, but that also the school value indicates a clustering of these. So all these individual levels on the base level can be clustered within these and have something in common on this school level. But that is a slightly more complex structure on the mixed model than just doing, for example, ID. But when I did this subgroup analysis, we only had 2 time points, and it was very hard use the mixed model in the way that maybe one would have. It's much easier on 3 measurements.
Yeah, of course.
So that was only a problem when I tried this subgroup analysis.
Okay.
So I needed to simplify the random effect structure.
But you didn't put out the school level then, because mostly the school level is a problem.
No, the school level was a part of the model.
Yeah, and it stays part of the model.
Yeah.
And did you have a lot of clustering in school level?
They were, I mean, all of the models indicated that there was some variation on school level. Yeah. Okay. But whether it was really problematic, I'm not sure. Because if I do remember correctly, a simple linear regression from 15 to 24, for example, gave much of the same answers as
that's always the case. When you can make it complicated with all kinds of random effects, but then at the end the results are more or less the same as just a single regression analysis.
Yeah.
But what you say about school level, in the other papers you didn't adjust for school level. Can you explain why?
Not as a fixed effect, and I mean I included it as a random effect.
But you didn't do it as a random effect, or not? In the other papers, because that's the same data set?
Yeah, I mean in the paper 2, which maybe you're in, the changes
paper 2 you have a school level as a random effect, but when the other papers not.
No, I didn't.
Which is basically the same data.
Yeah, that's exactly the same data set. It's just different types of. I did try including them. Okay. But on these types of analysis, the model threw singularity warnings at me that there were no variation within the random effects.
Yeah, that normally happens.
So in those analysis,
it
wasn't necessary to use random effects.
I thought so.
Because they only threw warnings at me.
Yeah. That's terrible.
Yeah.
No, you know, a lot of people get very scared about the warnings that mixed models give. Yeah. But I always tell my students, well, if you get a warning, just kick it out, and then it's okay. Yeah. And so that's what you did.
Yeah, basically.
About the development over time.
Yeah.
You analyze development over time, and I always have discussions with other people who do that kind of research, developing over time, and about covariates to add to the model. Yeah. And what I always say is that you must not add covariates that don't change over time into the model, because a covariate, like sex, for instance, and also maybe baseline age, they are not changing over time, so they're not related to the independent variable time, because they don't change over time. No. So, but in your paper, you adjusted for sex.
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Yeah, well, in the end, I guess it was practical reasons, because somehow that paper ended up with a lot of results. Yeah. And if we, in addition, would have done all this analysis separately by sex, it would have been an extreme amount of findings to report in one paper. So we tried to adjust the analysis for, or average the estimates over time over the levels of sex. So yes, it was included, and then I used a package in R, which is called estimated marginal means, which average the estimated marginal means.
Yeah, just the estimations of the mixed model analysis.
It's averaged over the levels of sex at each time point. So I guess I believe that there would be some sex differences, which could affect
definitely sex differences in the development of time, because you added an interaction with sex as well, I guess. Yeah, and to see whether or not they're different.
Yeah. Yeah, I did that, at least for MVPA. We did the interaction analysis, where we saw, of course, that MVPA changed differently between sex. Yeah.
Hey, something else about, I like the violin plots. Really, it's typical R, I think.
Yeah, it's very good for plotting.
Yeah, I don't like R very much, so I don't use R.
What do you use?
I use Stata. I like Stata a lot, but Stata is not that good for the thing, and I really like the violin plots. So can you mail me the code for R, the R code for making the violin plots?
Of course.
Because I really like them, and it's a bit the same with box plot, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
I guess.
Nice. I like, they're sort of ice creams sometimes. Some they are ice creams.
Yeah.
Some of them I found ice creams.
I mean, I could have easily used box plots. I just liked the look of the variant plots.
I like them a lot. I like them a lot. Okay, about in the same paper, you say something about missing data, and I'm always interested in missing data.
Yeah.
And you say that missing not at random, that leads to highly biased results, which is absolutely true. And you also said it in the first part of this defense, that because you believe that you have a lot of variables measured in your study, and you have looked at the relationship between all your variables and the missing data, that you probably have missing at random and not missing not at random. But can it be possible that even though you have a lot of variables that are related, they're still missing not at random?
Yeah.
And I think it is.
Yeah.
And so, but you claim more or less that you don't have missing not at random.
I honestly don't believe that a lot of them, but I do think in any study, it's usually end up by many just say, okay, we did this analysis under the MAR assumption.
Of course,
and
otherwise you can't do any analysis anymore.
And you just put that sentence in, and you keep it like that.
That's what everybody's doing.
But I do believe that in every study, the reality is that you have a mixture of mechanisms as to why the data is missing, and you probably have something completely at random, which is probably the least common because it's so random, and you have a missing at random and missing not at random. I do believe, though, that, for example, males, they didn't want to come as much as females in this study, but we have that variable. Maybe it can explain some of the missingness, and so on. We saw differences in socioeconomic status, number of Norwegian parents. I mean, we had quite a lot of variables, which made me believe that the missing values could be recovered under the MAR assumption. And they were also, I mean, most of the longitudinal studies with MNAR and MAR, how they are put together, these letters. I mean, it's very common in elderly cohorts that when the elderly don't come back for a follow-up measurement, something has happened, and maybe it's directly related to the outcome that you measure. So that's a highly plausible mechanism among elderly. I'm not sure how plausible it is for these younger people. Maybe for some, probably for some, of course, but I do believe that the MAR assumption is a reasonable assumption here.
Yeah, you know, what you say is true. Everybody writes it down. Yeah. And I always ask more or less the same questions, because how do you know? Yeah. And they said, yeah, well, I think like this, and I think you're right, because that may be true what you say. And the problem is, if it's not at random, then all your results are basically biased, and that's really a problem, because sometimes it's a simulation study to see what's the influence is of missing not at random, but it's really terrible. Yeah. It's really terrible. So it is not nice to say in a paper, my missing were probably not at random, because then the whole study can be gone. But I think you're right. You know, that's the good thing about your study, that you really measured a lot of variables, and you can say much about it, and it's probably most of the time missing at random, I guess. So that's nice. That's nice. Okay. Another thing is that in your paper, suddenly, in the discussion, you introduced machine learning. And you say something about XGBoost. Yeah. And I'm working, or one of my PhD students is now looking at can we use machine learning methods in epidemiology, and do we need machine learning methods in epidemiology? And I wondered, why did you use XGBoost for something? It's not even a question of your paper, because you looked at all kinds of variables related to your outcome. How is it also reviewers that ask it? No, that was my curiosity, I guess, because I did find these results that I thought was unexpected, the ones in the highest BMI tertile suddenly went from the lowest to the highest MBPA, the same with the lowest tertile of VO2 max. And I really did believe, before we started the study, that if with all the variables that we collect at 9 and 15, you'd get a pretty good idea of the physical activity level at 24. Let's say, for example, you're
an inactive 9-year-old. You have low physical fitness, high obesity, low socioeconomic status, a minority perhaps. All of these together would likely, I would predict this child to be an inactive adult. But these trends are not, they are not in my data set at all. I mean, it's barely an improvement over flipping a coin, this model that I made.
So it's 45%.
Yeah, I think it's 53, 54%, yeah. So, I mean, so I used XGBoost because I wanted to use a model that perhaps could capture any type of relationship in my data that a simpler model maybe wouldn't have picked up on, or I would have needed to know about it in order to model it correctly. I've seen also, I'm not sure if you know the website Kaggle. No, it's a data science website, and they post prediction competitions weekly, and sometimes monthly, and then bigger competitions. And it's quite a prize for the winners, at least of the bigger competitions. So that's data analysts and scientists from all over the world who gets these competitions, and they try to build the best predictive model.
With the best technique.
Yeah, I mean, and the winning model is often just 0.1 better than the next, so it's not really a major difference. But here in the competition, it matters. And ever since XGBoost came, I'm not sure if it was in like 2016 or 2017, more or less every winning team has deployed XGBoost.
Okay.
So it's a very powerful algorithm. It needs.
Is it then evaluated by the area under the curve or something like that, or?
You know, well, if it's a classification problem, I would say that it's probably not measured by accuracy. No. It's probably either the ROC area under the curve, or maybe the MSSE, the means square. But I'm not really sure how they have evaluated these competitions.
But your model was not prize winning.
I didn't. I have not participated in these competitions. Maybe I should try and see how far behind I am. But it's no. I mean, it's just it got. I guess that just it made me curious.
Yeah.
You know, that's
curiosity
I guess
is always good.
Yeah.
For the scientist, it's always good.
Yeah.
Okay,
and I enjoy trying new things, so I wanted to see to what extent that machine learning algorithm could predict physical activity.
What do you think about machine learning methods?
That's
nothing to do with your thesis, but I'm just curious how you think. But you think about machine learning methods for epidemiology or for sports science or whatever.
No, I think it has. I like it. I mean, it's. Let's say, for example, for my imputation model as well, I use a machine learning algorithm.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to ask you something about it when we are at paper 4, I guess. Okay.
Okay, we can wait until
wait
you have
paper 4, and then
yeah.
we continue the discussion. Okay, that's good. That's good. And about paper 2, the tracking analysis, because you looked at tracking it from 9 to 24, and also 9 to 15, but you didn't report it, I think. Just say something about it.
I don't remember whether it was maybe 9 to 15 is reported, but the sex differences I don't think is reported, or it's the other way around.
No, but anyway, did you also use a mixed model to do that, to do tracking, or did you do 2 tracking analysis when you just simple regression analysis with 15.9 and 24.9?
I did use the mixed model, but that's when I reduced the complexity of the random factors down to school level, because it was a completely different structure on the data.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's move on to paper 3. And in paper 3, you use a causal framework. And I was wondering why you use that causal framework, but I think I know the answer already, because at the second measurement, you have a lot of variables and you didn't measure those variables. So therefore you use that, I think, a bit strange causal framework that you looked at a predictor at 15 for an outcome at 24 and an adjustment for 9. But did you not think about maybe an analysis on the same time point, because temporality is not then in your model, but now you put in a sort of time lag of 9 years, which is, I think, quite a lot.
So you're asking whether I considered doing like a longitudinal
yeah,
change in the
I was wondering why you didn't do an analysis with 9 to 15, 15 to 24, but you missed 15, so that's a problematic thing. Yeah. So that's one of the reason.
No, I mean, one of course was that the Panks 2 when they were 15, that was a different type of study, so there was much less variables collected. Yes, because it would have opened up for a wide range of different types of analysis if we had all time points.
Yeah, definitely.
And I would also have to say that that particular period after paper 2, the particular period between adolescence and young adulthood also piqued my interest, and I saw that there were very little literature about it. On these types of associations over that particular period of life. So I wanted to look into that. And also this, as I've kind of concluded early in the thesis, that the relationship between these variables are so complicated, particularly perhaps the relationship between physical activity and BMI, which may be bidirectional. So if I wanted to model, let's say I used at 15 and I also adjusted for BMI at 15, clearly BMI can confound the relationship between physical activity and cardiometabolic risk. I believe BMI can easily affect physical activity and it can easily affect cardiometabolic risk. Can be a
mediator?
Huh?
Can be a mediator as well?
Yes, and that's the problem. It can easily mediate some of the effect of physical activity. So even though it's a confounder, it would take away some of the effect of physical activity. But when we included it at age 9, it became slightly less plausible that the effect of physical activity at age 15 would work through BMI at 9 and then
that's not possible, actually.
No, I mean, it's...
Or BMI is so straight, it tracks quite well, so BMI 9 is sort of proxy for BMI 15.
If these follow each other all the way, I mean, there could perhaps be some relatable, but it's so
the problem of tracking is also problematic in this kind of stuff, because if you think you have an outcome at 24, if it tracks very well, then the outcome at 24 is more or less the same as the outcome at age 15, and then you're just doing a temporary relationship between the two variables, something like that. But do you know, in general, you use causal framework and with the idea to get some idea about causality. What do you think about causality in observational studies? Can we really say something about causality when we have an observational study like this, even though it's longitudinal?
I mean, in the end, I guess the answer is, in practice, in theory is no, but much of the research that affects the decisions that we make comes from longitudinal studies, and I guess, I don't know, I guess if you have a solid data set, meaning a large number of participants, you're able to model an exposure measured prior in time to the outcome. Maybe you have even prior levels of both the exposure and the outcome prior to your exposure of interest. Maybe you can try to include them in your analysis. And you have a reasonable set of confounding variables to adjust for. And if you, in addition to that, I'm not sure if you catched on with the e-values that I use.
Yeah, I have a question about that as well.
Yeah, if they are high and indicate that the amount of unmeasured confounding here has to be high to negate this type of association that you observe, then I believe that you can get quite good evidence.
Close to causation.
Close to causation. I mean, I would never say that it's not a randomized controlled trial, but I believe you can put the causal word in your mouth at times with observational studies.
Between quotes.
Yeah, maybe, maybe. Yeah.
Now, I know that a lot of people think that in longitudinal studies you can say something about causation, and I don't think you can say very much about causation. I think you're right. You can make the word between brackets or something like that.
Yeah.
But causation, I think, randomized controlled trials is still the best option for saying something about causation.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you can't beat the randomization procedure in getting comparable groups.
I agree. No. Well, you also already mentioned the E-value.
Yeah.
And that's also introduced by Van der Welen, the E-value. And I wanted to look at a paper you quote you said, for looking at what the E-value was, but then I thought, well, I'm here, and you use the E-value, so you probably can tell me what the E-value actually means, and it has something to do with unmeasured confounding, as far as I know. But how does it work?
Well, I mean, the mathematics beneath is not my area of expertise.
I don't need the formulas or something, but how can you measure with a value unmeasured confounding? Because it's unmeasured.
Yeah, no, that's, honestly, that's, I cannot explain to you in other words than that with his approach, based on the standard error and or with the confounding set that you have used in your model, if you get a high E-value, then the amount of confounding needs to be large. So to negate that association, how he does that calculation, I'm not really sure.
Because it's used quite a lot, actually, the E-value nowadays.
I've seen that it's taken off, and I know that he has quite a mathematical head, so I don't really doubt his calculation of it. He's certainly much more...
That's dangerous. That's very dangerous.
Yes, I guess that's quite dangerous. Maybe I should.
I can imagine. I do the same because I don't know the maths well. So that's good.
So no, but I guess so. For example, in an easy, let's say for a causal example that could, or maybe an example of where you could believe that something is causal. Maybe if you look at, for example, physical activity and lung cancer, and the development of lung cancer, and you have this longitudinal relationship, and you have included smoking as a confounder, including a rich set of other things, but I believe that the smoking would probably be the strongest confounder.
I agree.
If you then additionally get a very high E-value, then that means that these unmeasured confounders would need to negate these results over and above the included confounders in your model, so they would have essentially need to be much stronger than smoking.
Which is probably not the case.
No.
So then you end up with a low E-value.
Yeah.
A low E-value indicates a low unmeasured confounding.
So no, a low E-value needs that the confounding needed is low.
Okay.
Okay, so you don't need much confounding. A high E-value means that the confounder needs to be strong here to negate the result. Yeah, a low E-value means that your result is more fragile.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Another thing is that in the results section on paper 3, on page 15, you report that you compare the complete cases with the results based on multiple imputation. And what you say there is, and I was really intrigued about that, is that the standard errors in your complete case analysis were higher than the one in the multiple imputation analysis.
Yeah. And,
well, of course, you have more subjects in your multiple imputation analysis, so that's the reason why the standard errors become lower.
Yeah.
But the general idea of multiple imputation is that you increase your standard error due to the uncertainty of the imputations. And because you do a lot of imputations, I really thought that the standard error would be higher than a complete case analysis because there is a huge uncertainty in your estimates.
Yeah.
But that was not the case, and I think it was quite a lot lower.
It's a lot lower, and that probably also speaks to the amount of missing data that's been excluded from this complete case analysis because there are so few observations. So no, I mean, I've done some simulation studies on that, and of course, this type of approach that I used do tend to get smaller standard errors than a complete case analysis, where a lot of participants are deleted through list-wise deletion.
Yeah, I know that.
But if you maintain a complete, if you use a complete data set and then you create missing values and then you try to recover it with multiple imputation, then the multiple imputation analysis will have higher standard errors than this original complete case analysis. So it does try to account for the uncertainty of missing values here. But
because
yes,
you have so little amount of subjects in your complete case analysis, probably it doesn't go up as much as you maybe thought.
If I had fewer probably missing values, it would be more like expected. You would have expected, I believe. Okay. I believe so.
Yeah, because a lot of people use multiple imputation only to increase their power. Yeah. That is what happens if you had low standard errors. Yeah. So you have higher power, but that's probably caused by the huge amount of missing data.
Because I believe that I would have had extremely low power if I had done the complete case analysis. Yeah. So that was the main reason actually for us using that. Yeah.
Well, about the multiple imputation, and I move on to paper 4 now because that you use multiple imputation as well. Well, maybe I want your opinion about the number of missing subjects. You have 450 missing subjects, I calculated, so that's about 64% missing. Yeah. And you impute 64% missing data. Yeah. That's really a lot. Yeah. Do you still think that the multiple imputation makes sense if you really have so many missing data points?
I believe that it makes sense if I have good predictors of the missing values. And maybe for some of my variables included in that analysis, maybe I didn't have that. Yeah. But I do believe that, for example, for BMI, for waist circumference, well, all these variables actually that track highly. Because then we have the values at age 9, and perhaps also other proxy measures like BMI would probably be a good predictor for most of them. And we have other variables. So yes, I believe for these variables that track well, that the baseline measure of that particular variable is a very good predictor of the missing value. But for insulin, for example, who has such low tracking, I think maybe the only thing I hope that it does is that it maintain the main effect between, for example, physical activity and insulin, that it doesn't induce any noise in that relationship, but only that it makes it more efficient and we increase the power in the analysis, hopefully. That's why I always like to do both analysis. I like to see that.
No, I agree with that. I think that's very important. There's a sort of sensitivity analysis to see what the influence of multiple imputation is in this case.
And also plot the imputed data points also reassured me in the sense that it respected the distribution of the observed data, and it was very evenly distributed.
I always have the discussion with other people about imputation. When I said if you can impute 64% of your missing data, you can also impute 99% of your missing data, and maybe you can also impute 100% of your missing data. So you can make up data. Can you make up data based on multiple imputation?
I like to think of it as preserving what we have collected rather than creating new values, because by doing this other types of analysis, we are deleting so much of the data that's been collected. And to me, that is what multiple imputation is. We try to preserve the work that's been done before. But of course, it does show up a range of plausible values in different imputed data sets. However, I don't think of it as making up data. I think of it as preserving what we have and hopefully preserving the main effects that are already present in the data.
Thing, I agree with that. And well, we talked about machine learning before, and you used random forest analysis to impute your data. Why?
Well, I wanted to do what they call a flexible imputation, and what they often mean by that is that one set of multiply imputed data set, it can be used for different types of analysis. So for example, in the last paper, I did them separately by sex. In a normal imputation approach, I would have either needed to impute them separately by sex, or I would have to add the interaction of sex between some of the variables, so that the multiple
model.
The multiple imputation knows that this is going on here. And that would be the same for nonlinear effects, for example, if we were looking for that. And also quite a bit of distributional assumptions for some of the methods normally deployed in normal multiple imputation. Random forest, I mean, some of the beauty of random forest is that it can handle large mixed type data set. I mean, you can have any type of variable, don't really have to change it, it can handle it. Collinearity it can handle as well, and it has no distributional assumptions. It can also detect interactions in your data and nonlinear relationships. So it's very easy to use, and then you can do a range of analysis on this particular imputed data later. But if I, for example, would have wanted to look at a nonlinear relationship and I had used a more traditional approach, I would have to impute it again and then tell the imputation model that this is actually nonlinear. So it's very flexible in that sense.
Why didn't you use XGBoost then? Because basically they are more or less comparable.
Yeah, because I would have done much more coding myself. Because this was a written package using...
It's a practical solution.
Yes, it was a practical solution. And random forest also has usually has a very good prediction or performance out of the box, as long as you give it the model what they call enough trees. So it's very easy to handle, while the XGBoost, you need to tune it more, as I say. There's a lot of hyperparameters, and you need to tune it in order to get the best performance. When you do it, it's fantastic.
So it's easier to use.
Yes, it's easier to use. It's easier out of the box to get good predictions. I guess some of the criticism or uncertainty surrounding random forest is that prediction is not imputation, and maybe random forest is so good at predicting that you get very little variation between your imputed data sets. That's been some uncertainty. So what they did in this package was that they added predicted mean matching on top.
That's good. I like that.
So to try
that makes much more sense, actually.
to increase the variability between the imputed data sets. And I also went into and did some checks here and there just to see that some of these analysis.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and that
there is some noise in it.
Yeah, and that there were a difference here. I mean, this, so imputation 59 differs from 60 and 61 and so on. And they did have a variability. So I believe that we managed to create the variability that we wanted in order to do multiple imputation.
I see, Well, I like it, you know, that because a lot of people, especially now when those packages are easy to use, they just do the package and then that's it. But I really like it that you look at the data, what's happening when you perform a random forest, or what's happening when you perform an XGBoost or whatever. And I think it's that's what we should do, and a lot of people don't. And so I'm glad that you did. But you are a fan of machine learning.
I am, I have to say, because they can handle so many problems. They can handle regression problems, classification problems, ranking problems. It's flexible, and yes, I do believe that.
What about the interpretation of the results?
Imputation?
No, the interpretation of the results.
Oh yeah, I can't say that I'm a major fan as compared to a normal regression. No, because still, to me, I find it more intuitive to look at a coefficient and the confidence interval. But I mean, what you get out after a machine learning algorithm is that you can get the importance of the factors included. So you can see which one was really important here in making the predictions, and you can also see the gain, for example, in accuracy by including these specific predictors. So you can also compare them and see, okay, so here the gain in accuracy dropped really high. Maybe we only need these top 5 predictors, for example. But you don't really see how they are related.
They are.
No.
Now we are struggling with that, you know. We are performing a lot of machine learning algorithms, but we don't know how to interpret the results in a very easy way
No.
that you can use it and that you can communicate with other people that
I agree.
about the strongness of
I agree. That is a problem, and hopefully in the future, maybe it will be easier, for example, to visualize what actually
yeah,
this
that will
model is
probably
finding.
improve, and maybe
Yeah.
there will be some interpretation later on.
Yeah.
Okay, it's almost done. I have some questions, but about the stability coefficient.
Yeah.
I did tracking analysis myself a lot actually.
I know.
And you mentioned in your paper that the stability you make some fixed cutoff values for your stability coefficients.
Yeah.
And well, I don't think you should use fixed coefficients because the stability coefficient, you know, the follow-up period is
Yeah.
major importance.
Yeah.
The measurement error you have is of major importance.
Yeah.
So I think to get those strict cutoff values, people are using those strict cutoff values. Okay, and it doesn't matter how long the period is. If you even have a short period, then you expect much higher tracking coefficients than when you have a long period. So why did you mention those?
That was actually the first time, and that was actually also an input from a reviewer that they wanted to easier for them to interpret whether a stability coefficient was strong or weak or moderate. So I guess I included that with a reference of someone who has said something like that before.
Yeah, I know that there are references
And but I did try to sort of phrase it as maybe if I saw a stability coefficient of 0.55, I don't feel that it's the same. Okay, so this is moderate, but systolic blood pressure at 0.33, that's also moderate, but it's not the same.
Not the same, no.
So maybe I try to word it as moderate to strong, and then moderate to weak, or maybe try to nuance it somewhat. But no, I mean, that's not ideal, I agree. And that's the problem with cut points in general, I believe.
Yeah,
because
I totally agree.
as soon as you're close to the threshold, I mean, you're very similar, but you can easily end up in two different categories.
I always tell my students that cut points in statistics are always arbitrary.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. And that's this is exactly the same, I think.
Yeah, this is completely arbitrary.
Yeah. Another thing, this is my last question, and then I'll leave you alone. But then maybe we can talk about football a bit, but maybe we can do that tonight as well.
Yeah.
Another thing about the stability or the tracking coefficients, because in your results section, or in your statistical analysis section, at the end you say that you are using statistical significance adjusted for multiple testing for tracking.
Yeah.
And maybe that's also asked by a reviewer, but why do you want to test statistical significance for a stability coefficient, which is not that interesting, I guess?
I mean, no, that's a good question. We included that just out of habit of including the p-values.
It's always the last sentence of every statistical analysis section.
But you can, if you look at the tracking table, I mean, that's almost completely waste because almost all of them are significant.
Of course,
and always in tracking,
it's not a measure of that it's good or something like that.
No,
it's just significant because
it just gives you incredible little amount of information.
Yeah,
so no, I could have easily cut that out, but I did think that do I dare publish or try to submit a paper without providing the p-values? I guess I thought that the reviewers would comment on that, and so I thought
reviewers don't know anything. Most reviewers don't know much about statistics, definitely not.
Maybe not, but maybe then, especially if they didn't know much about it, they would definitely miss the p-value because they would expect it to be.
They always ask for significant testing.
So I found it a small price for me to pay just to include it because I guess they can stand there as long as all the other more important information also is in the table.
Sure.
So if I had to choose between them, of course the p-values would go.
I can imagine. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think it was a very nice discussion.
You too.
Thank you a lot.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Thank you to the committee and thank you to the candidate. The examination committee will now leave the room to evaluate the dissertation and make their final decision. I ask for the rest of you to stay in the auditorium. I will announce the committee's decision within a few minutes.
rise.
And now to the serious business. The examination committee has found Anders Husøy's dissertation of October the 9th, 2024 satisfactory. The committee's conclusion is unanimous. On behalf of the rector of Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, I hereby award Anders Husøy the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Sports Science. Congratulations. And you will receive your diploma at the ceremony in August, at the start of the next academic year. I will ask the committee and the new Doctor of Philosophy to join me in a procession out of the auditorium, and I hereby declare the disputation for completed.